Full story. They thought she was just a float nurse, until Special Ops arrived and called her by her secret code name. They thought she was just a float nurse, until Special Ops arrived and called her by her secret code name. True real-life story. Third-person narrative. 2,100 words. Nobody really paid attention to the woman who floated between wards. She came in every shift carrying a plain tote bag and a coffee cup. She wore standard-issue scrubs. Nothing personalized, no name badge lanyard with cartoon characters or motivational quotes like the other nurses had. Her shoes were worn but clean. She moved through the hospital hallways without making noise, without drawing eyes, without stopping to chat at the nurses' station the way everyone else did. She did her job, she did it well, and when the shift ended, she left. Nobody really thought about her much after that. Her name was Maggie Osei, and she was a float nurse. For anyone who doesn't know what that means, a float nurse is someone the hospital calls when there's a gap. A ward is short-staffed, someone calls in sick, there's an overflow situation on the 3rd floor at 2 in the morning. They call the float. The float shows up, fills the hole, does the work that needs doing, and moves on. No fixed ward, no regular patients who know your name, no colleagues who save you a seat in the break room. Just work, just wherever you're needed. Most people who work in hospitals don't think highly of float nurses. That's just the honest truth. They're treated like temporary staff even when they've been doing the job for years. They're handed the difficult patients, the extra paperwork, the rooms nobody else wants. The ward coordinators assign them the worst shifts, because it's easy to do that to someone who doesn't belong to your team. Maggie knew this. She had known it since her first week at Mercy General, and she had never once complained about it. Her supervisor, a coordinator named Dana Price, was exactly the kind of person who treated float staff like they were disposable. She would look at Maggie through the glass of her office window, pick up a clipboard, and slide the worst assignment across the counter without even glancing up. Overnight, in the high-dependency overflow. Weekend cover in the trauma recovery bay. 2 weeks of back-to-back night shifts over a public holiday. Every single time, Maggie would take the sheet, look at it once, fold it into her pocket, and go. No argument, no sigh, just acceptance. Dana thought it was because Maggie was timid. Quiet people must be easy to push around. That's what Dana believed. So she kept pushing. What she didn't know was that Maggie wasn't quiet because she was timid. She was quiet because she had spent nearly a decade training herself to take up as little space as possible, to be useful and unnoticeable at the same time, to be the kind of person who could walk into a room and not change the atmosphere. Where she had come from, that skill wasn't a personality trait, it was a survival tool. You didn't really look at her, you just assumed she was temporary, the kind of person who was passing through. There was one person at Mercy General who had started to notice things about Maggie. A younger nurse named Dara Finch, 2 years into the job and still curious enough to pay attention. Dara had been assigned to shadow Maggie on a Tuesday afternoon shift, not because anyone planned it, but because the ward was disorganized and someone had written the wrong name on the rota. By the time the mistake was discovered, they were already 3 hours in, and it didn't seem worth fixing. What Dara noticed first was Maggie's hands. They were steady, in a way that most nurses' hands weren't. Not just professionally steady, everyone develops that over time, but something else. Something that didn't quite fit the setting. When a patient came in mid-afternoon with a head injury from a road accident, most of the staff moved quickly, but with that background hum of stress that comes with any unexpected situation. Maggie moved quickly too, but she moved like someone who was solving a familiar problem. Not calm in the way of someone who was used to the hospital. Calm in the way of someone who had been in situations much worse than this, and had still found a way through. Then there was the afternoon the blast injury patient came in. He had been brought in through the emergency bay. The official record said it was a construction accident, and maybe that was even partly true. But the injury pattern didn't quite match what you'd expect. Dara stood in the doorway and watched Maggie work. The speed at which Maggie read the wound, the way her eyes moved across the patient's body in a systematic sweep that took about 3 seconds and apparently told her everything she needed to know. She called for specific supplies before anyone else in the room had even formed a full sentence about what was needed. Dara brought it up later, carefully, the way you do when you're not entirely sure what you're asking. Maggie just smiled. Not a dismissive smile, but the kind of smile that meant she had heard the question behind the question and was choosing not to answer it. She said something about having trained in a lot of different environments before she came to Mercy General. Then she changed the subject. Dara let it go. For a while. The night everything changed started quietly. Most nights that change everything do. It was a Tuesday again. Maggie seemed to get a lot of her interesting shifts on Tuesdays, and the hospital was running at about normal capacity. Maggie was on her third hour of an overnight shift, working the corridor between the medical ward and the recovery bays, when Dana Price came out of her office, looking like someone had told her something she wasn't sure how to process. She was on the phone. She kept nodding even though whoever was on the other end couldn't see her. Then the calls started coming in from the hospital administration. A wing was being temporarily restricted. Staff were redirected. Access cards were remotely disabled for certain corridors. This kind of thing happened occasionally. A patient with serious security concerns. A witness being kept under protection. Something that required a quiet rearrangement of the hospital's usual flow. Most of the nursing staff accepted it without too many questions, because questions weren't encouraged in those moments. But this felt different. The way the administrator spoke to Dana, the speed at which the changes were implemented, the fact that when the restricted patient arrived, there was a federal escort with him, not police, not hospital security, and the two people accompanying him wore civilian clothes that somehow looked less civilian the more you looked at them. Dana was visibly stressed. She had started doing that thing where she kept rearranging things on her desk that didn't need rearranging. Nobody on the ward had clearance to treat the incoming patient. The hospital was essentially holding its breath, waiting for someone from outside to come and take over. They arrived just after midnight. 4 men came through the side entrance of the hospital, the one that most staff used to come in from the car park. They moved in a way that was hard to describe, but easy to feel. There was no rushing, no urgency in their body language, but they covered ground quickly anyway. The lead man was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 40s, and he was wearing a plain jacket over dark trousers with nothing. No badge, no identification visible, to suggest what he was or where he'd come from. He had the kind of face that gave nothing away. His name, as Dara would later find out, was Colonel Reyes. But nobody introduced him that night. He didn't seem like someone who needed introducing. The hospital security guard stopped them at the entrance to the restricted corridor, which was technically his job and probably not the most comfortable moment of his career. Reyes handed over a document without breaking stride. The guard looked at it again, stepped aside. The 4 men kept walking. Dara was at the nurse's station, pretending to update patient notes on the computer screen, watching all of this through the glass partition. She told herself she was just keeping an eye on things the way any responsible nurse would. Really, she was just deeply curious and didn't know how to stop being that. Reyes and his men moved down the corridor and turned the corner toward the recovery bay, and then they stopped. Maggie was standing there. She had her back to them, changing an IV bag on a patient near the corridor wall, doing what she always did, just working. Reyes looked at her for 1 second. Then he said a word. Not nurse. Not, excuse me. A single short word. A name that wasn't the name on her badge. A name that sat in that corridor like it had been waiting there for years to be spoken out loud. What happened next was small. That was what made it so striking. Maggie's hand stilled on the IV line. Not a flinch, not a jerk, just a pause. The kind of pause you can only see if you're watching closely. She finished attaching the line, said it carefully, and then she turned around. Her posture didn't change dramatically. She didn't straighten up in some theatrical way. It was more like something that had been gently compressed for a long time, just quietly returned to its natural shape. She looked at Reyes, the way you look at someone you've been through something serious with. Not warmly, not coldly, but with the weight of shared experience. "Colonel," she said. Just that, nothing more. Every single one of those men looked at her like she was the most important person in that corridor, and she was just holding an IV bag. From the nurse's station, Dara watched the whole thing. She said later that what she felt in that moment wasn't shock exactly. It was more like the sensation of a picture you've been looking at for weeks, suddenly clicking into focus. Every small thing she had noticed about Maggie, the steadiness, the way she worked in a crisis, the particular pattern of her attention, the way she never seemed rattled, All of it arrived at once and made complete sense. Over the next few hours, what Maggie was became known, in fragments, to the handful of people close enough to see. She had not come to Mercy General directly from nursing school or another hospital. Before this, before the plain tote bag and the disposable coffee cups and the overnight shifts on wards nobody wanted, she had served for nearly a decade as a combat medical specialist, embedded with a classified field unit, one of a very small number of women to hold that role in that particular program. The code name Reyes had used in that corridor was the name she had operated under during that time. The things she had seen and done in that capacity were, and would remain, classified. She never spoke about them. She had specifically chosen not to speak about them. What was known, what Dara pieced together from the edges of conversations she was technically not supposed to be close enough to hear, was that Maggie had left the field after a mission that went wrong. Two people she had worked alongside for years didn't come home. She did. And she had carried that ever since, in the way that people carry things they don't put down, quietly, continuously, and completely alone. She had come to Mercy General to be ordinary. That was the word she eventually used, months later, in the only real conversation she and Dara ever had about any of it. She had wanted to use what she knew to help people, but she didn't want to be known for it. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want to be anybody's story. She just wanted to show up and do the work and go home. That night, she did what Reyes needed her to do. She walked into the restricted room, and she took over care of the patient, a man whose injuries required the exact kind of knowledge she had spent a decade building in conditions that no hospital training could replicate. She worked through the night. Reyes and his men waited outside. They didn't hover over her or offer guidance. They just waited, because they already knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was capable of. By 6 in the morning, the restricted wing had been cleared. The patient was stable. The unit was gone. Reyes had not said goodbye, or at least, not in any way that anyone else heard. The corridor looked exactly the way it always did. Maggie came back to the nurse's station. She picked up a pen. She sat down and started filling in a medication chart for a different patient. A routine task. Completely ordinary. The kind of thing she did 50 times a shift. Dana Price arrived for the morning handover at 6:30, and, without any awareness of what had happened 8 feet from where she stood, slid the new shift assignment across the counter. Pediatric overflow, weekend cover, the usual. Maggie took the sheet, looked at it once, folded it into her pocket, and went. Months later, Dara asked her about it. She kept it gentle, one question, carefully placed, leaving plenty of room for Maggie to simply not answer. Maggie was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the car park below, where the morning shift nurses were pulling in one by one. Then she said, "The reason she became a float nurse is because float nurses go where they're needed and don't make anyone depend on them." Dara thought about that for a long time afterward. It sounded like a practical statement about a job, but the more she turned it over, the more she understood that it was also the most personal thing Maggie had ever said out loud. It was a description of how she had chosen to live, present when it mattered, invisible the rest of the time, useful without being permanent, needed without being known. A whole life, built around showing up quietly and doing what had to be done. And every person in that hospital had walked past her for months without once understanding what that really meant. Approx. 2,100 words,